Welcome, everyone, to the Everyday Investor Podcast. Shortly, I'm going to share another conversation I had recently with Hayden Brown, human behavioral specialist. First, let me ask you a question. Do you believe it's possible to build more wealth using a values-based approach, an approach that lines up what's important to you with the finite set of choices that you get to make with your resources? As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, what happens on the inside eventually bubbles up and overflows into the outside world. What we feed our minds, therefore, influences our thought life. What we think about influences our speech life, our words, and that eventually influences our actions and ultimately our lives. So, of course, you may be stuck in a situation that's really hard or something that requires more than just a happy thought to get out of. But for the most part, for most people, you can achieve really massive improvements to your life simply by thinking about what you're thinking about and then, of course, changing it. I know, I've gone through this myself, and it works. It really does work. So let's consider your values. How can we discover what they are? Well, this was a fun game that I was playing today, and you might want to have a crack at this as well. I had a look at my social media feed, YouTube specifically. Here were just some of here were pretty much all of the thumbnails that I came across. Is Dave Ramsey wrong about paying off your mortgage? What's the rule of 72? Is the 4% rule dead? Rare Led Zeppelin footage discovered. String theory explained. The ideal stock and bond allocation by age. Now, when you look at my shorts feed, of course, it's a little bit different. How to clip chicken wings. Micro power generators. Tons of stuff about building and fixing things and engineering things. By far, though, beyond all the finance and all the how-to stuff, there are cat videos. Cat videos everywhere. Kittens making friends with chickens, surfing cats, cats in snow, cats getting pedicures. Goes on and on and on. I love cat videos. The crazy thing is, though, we don't even have cats, and I'm not even tempted in the slightest to get them. I just like the idea that there are cat videos on the internet so much I can't stand it sometimes. Okay, now I like cats, which is fitting because all of my other videos are about curiosity. Maybe that's where the cats went. Our values, though, aren't that hard to figure out when you review what you're consuming and thinking about during your free time. So have a look at your social media feeds if you're confused as to what's important to you. Sometimes it comes out in a really weird way. Other times it's pretty black and white. Hey, you like chickens and you like cats. What's the big deal with that, right? But is it possible, though, to build more wealth using a values-based approach? Personally, I think it is, but the first thing that we need to get clear on is our own values, not the values that other people have, especially those weird cat people. We don't need others to tell us what the most ethical investments are. I think we should just trust our own gut instincts more and take personal responsibility. That's it. Change your own world first, right? Now, once we're clear on our values, the second thing we should consider is our definition of wealth itself. Because if we're neglecting all the other values we have in pursuit of the biggest investment account, is that really wealth? Of course not, right? If your actions align to the things that are most valuable to you, without it harming yourself and others, of course, then chances are you're building wealth. In fact, as soon as your actions are genuinely unencumbered by what you should do or what you need to do, there's a good chance that you're actually already wealthy. So how do we get to that place? Perhaps it starts with thinking about what we put into our minds, what we think about, what we obsess about, or even fantasize about. Now, I love cat videos, right? I shouldn't have let that cat out of the bag, but I did. What if I use an alternative name for cat, even just once? Well, there's the purity of my YouTube feed gone, that's for sure. And I promise that doesn't go somewhere good. That doesn't end up in any good outcome. And it'll likely take away from the wealth that I have in my relationship with my wife, just as an example. That might be a bit close to home for a lot of people, but what you put in your mind shows up elsewhere, right? But it's challenging, and it's challenging providing this kind of advice in the context of financial advice when it's really hard for people to accept that they may indeed be part of the problem. But the good news is that when they do accept that, when I accept that I'm part of the problem too, we realize that we're actually also part of the solution. A values-based investment strategy, specifically one based on your values, may not make you rich, but it will make you wealthy. How do I know this? Because those times when I know that my own actions have been aligned to what matters most to me, whether it's a fluffy pet, or a healthy and happy family, I feel like I'm a purpose-based investor. I'm actually building something valuable in the world around me. And when we're all doing that, we're living according to our purpose. And you can't help but be content. That's got to be a good thing, right? Now, before we start, make sure that you have subscribed to the fortnightly newsletter, especially if you're into property and you have a mortgage. Next week, I'm sending out my updated mortgage strategy, which has changed massively. So if you want to take advantage of that, subscribe to that newsletter. I'll also be covering a lot more topics around the area of property and mortgages between now and the end of the year, just because I think it is quite important. That's it for this introduction, though. Let's make a start on the show. You're listening into the Everyday Investor Podcast, and I'm your host and financial advisor, Darcy Ungaro. In this podcast, I'll cover anything that can be useful for building new wealth in the new world. I don't mind if you have a lot or a little in your head or in your wallet. Learn with me how to be a better everyday investor. Check out the notes for articles, special deals, referral links, and to sign up to the free fortnightly newsletter. If you enjoyed this today, please leave a 5-star review, and most importantly, keep in mind that today can't be considered personalized financial advice. If you need that, reach out to me or contact your current financial advisor for input. Let's make a start. Welcome everyone to the Everyday Investor Podcast. Today, again, I'm joined by human behavior specialist Hayden Brown. How are you, Hayden?
I'm good, thanks, Darcy. Thanks for having me back.
Cool. Thanks for coming back. So on the previous episode, we covered a ton of ground, which I think is essential listening for anyone who hasn't caught it. Would very much recommend that you go back and check it out because we covered things like values, voids, and we finished up on a little bit of self-sabotage. So from your perspective, how can you really accurately sum up what we covered last episode?
So in the first episode...
Itadakimasu.
Welcome everyone to the Everyday Investor Podcast. Today, again, I'm joined by human behavior specialist Hayden Brown. How are you, Hayden?
I'm good, thanks, Darcy. Thanks for having me back.
Cool. Thanks for coming back. So on the previous episode, we covered a ton of ground, which I think is essential listening for anyone who hasn't caught it. Would very much recommend that you go back and check it out because we covered things like values, voids, and we finished up on a little bit of self-sabotage. So from your perspective, how can you really accurately sum up what we covered last episode?
So in the first episode, we spoke more about, again, how we all live by this hierarchy of values. Again, what's most important to least important in our life. Whether we know these values or not, our actions are already demonstrating it. And we went through, how you can look at your actions, how you can ask yourself, actually insightful questions to really peel back the layers and understand what's most important to you. I believe we also spoke about the principle of voids, which is something that I teach, which is that the perception of lack or the perception that something is yet to be fulfilled, missing, again, a void, very much corresponds with our values and what's most important. So, the obvious examples of, those who grow up with the perception that they haven't had wealth or opportunities. So understanding how our past perceptions of voids, again, conscious or unconscious, actually influence what's most important to us.
So in a sense, again, I'm butchering it using this analogy, but when you're really hungry, you're going to feed really deeply, right? You're going to drink deeply when you're super, super thirsty. But then when that thirst or that hunger is satisfied, you'll often stop drinking or you stop eating because you've actually solved the problem, which is avoiding pain. And
yes.
I guess the food analogy is kind of relevant, right? Because quite often when I'm catching up with investors, there is this tipping point where, all right, now we have enough. Now you actually are sorted, but you still want to / need to, for other reasons, engage with building wealth, right? So now we're going further. We're not just moving away from pain. We're potentially we're seeking pleasure. And I define that as ultimate fulfillment of purpose, because it's now not just at that lower levels of need. You're now working towards potentially a greater purpose. So for example, I'm just going to put a number out there for context. Let's say you have the $2 million and the debt-free home that you need, right? Retirement done. Not that that's necessarily the right numbers for everyone. The kids are sorted, done. You're in good health. You have a good relationship. Tick that box too. Yet there is this pot of money and you want to take risk with it and you want to grow wealth more. The very first question that I would ask is, why? what is your purpose? And that's where I think it gets interesting. It gets really interesting because these elements of why need to be really answered, not just from a negative point of view, but from a positive point of view. So as we start this conversation, what are some of the reasons why the same direction should be pursued, but for different purposes?
The pursuit of pleasure is, in many regards, very hedonistic, and for many people, it is very impulsive, and it is short-term thinking, right? So there is very much frankly, a substantial difference between being conscious of our values, but more specifically, acting in alignment with our values, which is truly when we're most engaged, most purposeful, and we're doing most meaningful action. We've talked a lot about meaning today. And now that is actually different from seeking pleasure. So seeking pleasure, I would say, is, look, one of my mentors once put it to me like this: seeking pleasure versus pain is very much motivation, which is extrinsic, requiring outside, motivation and survival mechanisms. Inspiration is more values driven. And so you're not wrong that we are all very influenced by the avoidance of pain and seeking from pleasure, but the transcended version of that, I guess one way of thinking about it, would be being values driven. And the primary reason why that's so important is because when we are acting in alignment with our values, Darcy, we actually turn on a completely different part of the brain. So we have what's called the amygdala, which is the seek and avoid part of the brain. It's the threat detection part of the brain. It's literally the part that comes alive when we're perceiving threats. Okay. We also spoke about in the former episode about how the unconscious, the psyche, is very much stores memories and experiences that we've associated, what we spoke before, that we've perceived as painful, to help us avoid what is painful and seek what is pleasureful. Very often, the avoidance of pain and seeking pleasure competes with our highest values and vision for our life. So I would tweak what you've said and say that, yes, avoiding pain, seeking pleasure is a part of the human experience, and I certainly don't judge clients for that. But there is a profound difference between acting, strategizing, and taking meaningful actions in line with our values, which doesn't have the same emotional volatility as the pain and pleasure avoidance mechanism. We actually use the prefrontal cortex there, which is all about long-term thinking, strategy, and self-governance. One quick example I'll give you is, if I'm doing something that's low priority to me, my accounting, for example, Matt Stringer, if you're listening, sorry, mate, but if I have a hiccup or something I can't work out in 10 minutes, I'll just pay him to sort it, because it's lower on my values. And so I don't have that same level of resilience and buy-in to it, right? I'm being run by the pain-pleasure system, essentially, avoidance of pain, seeking of pleasure, with my accounting and bookkeeping. But with my clients, let's say, God forbid, I had a client and we've done a couple of sessions and I didn't quite feel we're on track. I'm not frustrated by that. I'm actually brought in and just as motivated when we first start, because as you and I have spoke about, both of us naturally value problem solving, connecting the dots. So the point I'm alluding to there is pain and pleasure motivations have a lot more, essentially, baggage from the past and emotional volatilities and behavior patterns that come into it, versus values-driven actions is more objective, more strategic, and less emotionally volatile, which is absolutely crucial when we're talking about investing in self and building wealth.
Okay, because what I'm imagining in my head, and I think we're talking about the same thing, but what I'm imagining is kind of, and it's a pattern that we see in a lot of areas of our lives. There's acceleration, deceleration, accumulation, decumulation. There's moving away from and then pivoting towards chasing something bigger. And again, what I'm dealing with people, they're either in one phase or another phase, and their actions need to be the same regardless of the phase that they're in. But often there's like a mental decoupling and a re-hitching to another motivator that's required when you're at that apex. I guess what I'm trying to drive at is that there comes a point in people's lives where they do have enough, but they still want to engage in those activities like, hey, I want to invest partly just because I can. But I think that is so much more meaningful if they can hitch that to a greater motivator. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I just wonder, I'm curious about some of the nuances really around how to help people through that transition, because there does need to be almost like an event or a distinct marker that helps people justify changing some of their motivators. You know what I mean?
Yes. So what we'll do, if you like, I know that when we spoke at one point, we were going to, sort of discuss with how people can change their values, perhaps, or create, in this instance, create further buy-in. So I'll go through that if you like, because essentially it is the same. It is the same process. Okay. So again, if we start with knowing, as we've said, that we need to have meaning and purpose associated behind what we're doing, or else, frankly, our time will automatically go towards higher values, whether we know it or not. That's ultimately where procrastination comes from. People talk about procrastination, but actually they're prioritizing their higher values, not knowing that they're prioritizing their higher values, ignoring their lower values for the most part. So when it comes to setting new goals, and or let's say there surely must be a number of followers on this show who perhaps are self-aware enough, Darcy, to recognize that their actions do not in any way demonstrate that they are consistent or serious about wealth building, but they have this real intention, right? They're listening to your show, they love the guests, they love the information, and so what I would recommend, the first thing is they need to start with being clear on their existing values. So as you said earlier, if the audience hasn't listened to the first episode, we covered that. I gave the questions of how to actually go through and start to at least build some foundational awareness to what drives you in its current form. Now, once you have that, it is truly as simple as connecting the dots on how the goal that you would love to achieve, or the value that you would love to have in your values hierarchy, what you'd love to prioritize, how that benefits and supports your other values. So, for example, let's say that I'm not prioritized with my wealth and I would love to be more disciplined with my saving and investing. It would be wise for me to connect the dots on how saving and investing would support my other values. So if we give me as a case study, or even yourself, we've spoke about how problem solving is very important to both of us. Ongoing education is also very important to me. I often travel and teach seminars overseas. And so, one link for me that I used to raise my buy-in and value on wealth building is understanding that if I would love to, have opportunities to travel and teach, and, let's say a course comes up in London and it's next month, to have enough wealth and financial freedom where I can go and do that course because the course supports my business and serves my clients, well, actually the wealth building will grant me that opportunity, right? And so as much as these things sound obvious, it is very much true that those who aren't taking action, they haven't got these links firmed up in their mind, or perhaps there's a couple, but perhaps they're weak. Perhaps it's very much in theory, perhaps it's, if I have wealth or I create, savings, investing, I can, have the nice car. Well, perhaps that car is not related to their value structure. Or again, that's one answer. We're really talking about. I mean, if I asked you, Darcy, why is wealth important to you? I know that you could probably sit there and tell me for 30 minutes nonstop how it's supporting your children, how it's if you had a family member that got cancer, how you could support them. You would have a wealth of associations on how the wealth itself benefits your existing values, and that's what's most important to you. So whether it's trying to raise wealth building itself, which is the purpose of today's episode, into your hierarchy and be consistent with that, creating wealth in the mind, or whether it's creating a new goal and creating buy-in to that, it's knowing what your values are, identifying specifically what you'd love to achieve, and marrying the two together. Because the more separate we see it, the more compartmentalized our life would be. Congruency with the values, is the aim.
Congruency is key. Okay. No, that's good. And we started off saying that we're going to have a chat about this, but we haven't had a chat about this yet. So let's chat about this. Self-limiting beliefs, self-sabotage. No matter where you're at, whether you're accumulating or decumulating, these are the hidden things that can jump up and get the better of us. So let's start off with just a simple definition. What is a self-limiting belief, or what is self-sabotage?
Limiting beliefs, I would say, would be beliefs that you do not perceive as serving your highest values or vision for your life. In one regard, the word limiting is, I would say, is very sort of pop psychology. I have these limiting beliefs, but I think it's actually naive to say that they're limiting. All of these patterns, beliefs, self-sabotage we get caught up in all have one thing in common, which is avoidance of pain, right? So again, whether it's we'd love to, apply this new role, or we'd love to invest or learn about Bitcoin, you name it, but we're so afraid of what if I make a mistake because I've made a mistake in college or, in my last relationship, etc. The limiting belief side of things, to cut through the noise there, I rather than saying it's bad, I think that would be a little bit of a disservice to the audience, because it's attempting to keep us safe, Darcy, is what I'm trying to say there. But it is limiting in the sense that it is not congruent. The application of that belief is not congruent with the values that we'd like to achieve. Does that make sense on that? There's a bit in there. Yeah,
no, I think it does. It really is just it's a limiting belief in terms of it's limiting performance in some way. Yes. It's not necessarily good or bad. It just is. It's just a statement of reality that it's some wiring in your brain that's causing you to take some actions which are against your best interest, right?
Correct. That's a great way of putting it. And, your other question was self-sabotage, which, I absolutely love this topic. And it's probably self-sabotage and self-worth, are probably the two issues that I work with clients most regularly on. And ironically, would be the two dynamics that have the greatest impact on wealth building. Your image of self, your self-worth, and your ability to invest and believe in yourself that you're worth it. And again, equally, the self-sabotage. But really, self-sabotage is simply just a conflicting agenda or a hidden motivation in the mind that you're not conscious of. So before I just gave the example of, let's say an individual who says they want to lose, 10 kilos, but then on the weekend they go out and again, quote unquote, self-sabotage. Well, in any regards, they perhaps have a high value on relationships, right? And so, they're given an opportunity to go out. Maybe it's a friend's 40th. Maybe, their friends are meeting in town and they really want to connect with those friends. Now, perhaps, they have too many drinks. That's a different conversation. But ultimately their actions, you could say they're conflicting with one value or one goal of, losing the weight in this example, but they're actually supporting another value of connecting with their friends when they're going out and socializing. That's right. So again, this is where understanding, going back to that first principle, sorry to be a broken record, of the values hierarchy and the structure is absolutely crucial, because that becomes our framework for auditing our actions and goals in life. One more example I'll give is I had a client a couple of months ago that I was working with, and her goal was, ironically, she just said, Hayden, I'm really want to prioritize my health and well-being. For her, it was more prioritizing her mental health, doing the self-work, not going out, that sort of thing. And she came back to the session one week, and she sort of was expressing her disappointment that she hadn't met her expectations, and she hadn't, in fact, gone away with the girls for a weekend, and they'd had a sort of wine and platters and, cheese, all that good stuff. And she was saying it was a really meaningful weekend, but she drank too much and she was really disappointed in herself. And because we had previously done the values framework in subsequent sessions, I was able to actually really help her recalibrate and readjust her expectations for herself. And what we found out, Darcy, was that, she would go away with her girlfriends once a year. They would all, the husbands would look after the kids, and they'd all really connect. They're old school friends. And, doing the cheese, the wine, the Airbnb they do was such a deeply rewarding thing for her in her values hierarchy that, again, we say self-sabotage, but actually it's just a conflicting, we're fulfilling something else that's important to us, And perhaps there's confliction there, but again, it starts with understanding who we are, those values, and adjusting our goals around that.
Okay. So you've spoken a lot about this hierarchy in your value set, right? There is an order to these things, and therefore our actions should be congruent with the priority that we set around these things. Hopefully that's close enough to what you said.
No, that's perfect. Yes.
Okay. So let's say, really simple example, and this happens a lot with me, where I'll be talking to somebody who they have a mortgage on their own home, perhaps, and they also have a desire to invest. And so both of the activities of getting rid of the mortgage faster or investing at a greater rate, they're both great activities, right? One is what I would say is relatively conservative, and it can still be part of an investment strategy. I'd call it a sequential investment strategy, because you're creating financial security in your residence, in your home first, and then you can go about investing from a place of strength without having this risk of interest rate risk, right? So that's valid, but also a simultaneous strategy where you're doing both activities, debt repayment and building up your investment account, is also wise. And in some cases, it can be more beneficial. And so the conversation comes up of, well, should we be investing or should we be repaying our debt more aggressively? Often there is different values associated with that, right? Like one is kind of, you could interpret it as financial security, but really both avenues lead to the exact same outcome, which is financial security. I know it's a very broad definition, but how hard does this get when you start discovering that some of these values are really interconnected and often they're the same thing?
Look, that is a great question, and I think you'd see this in your work. So many ways to achieve financial freedom, and there are certainly ways that, whether we say are more aggressive, there might be ways that require more sacrifice in terms of family lifestyle, that sort of thing, right? And so that again does come down to the values hierarchy. I think what's important to emphasize is that the order, hence why we use the word values hierarchy, is a very substantial thing not to miss. So what I wouldn't want the audience to think is, okay, these are my three values. I mean, yes, that is a huge breakthrough in itself, but actually understanding the precise order of those values, right? Because, for example, if wealth building was my number one value, then perhaps I am willing to endure those pain points as it relates to the family spending less holidays, etc., in the pursuit of what's most meaningful, because the wealth building is highest on my values. And you'll remember earlier I spoke about, the pain versus pleasure paradigm versus the values paradigm transcends that to where we're more objective, we're more strategic, we're using the prefrontal cortex and we're thinking longer. So that's hopefully a great example of that, where if wealth building was number 1 or 2 on my priorities list, then I'm going to be able to endure more challenges in the pursuit of that mission. If it's lower on my values, as an example, let's say wealth building is, priority number 4, and, my personal growth is number 1, my family and lifestyle is number 2, and perhaps my health is number 3. Well, if I'm honoring that hierarchy, then perhaps let's say I was living in reverse, so it's actually my family, my growth, and my health that's number 1, 2, and 3, but I'm acting as if my wealth is number 1, well, that's a recipe for, self-depreciation, emotional volatilities, and in many cases, anxiety and depression, because you are now taking actions that you could say, well, that it's somewhat aligned with your values. Yes, wealth is in there, but you're putting that value above what is your highest values, if that makes sense. And your identity very much revolves around the single highest value. Yes, it's all three, but it's all of them. And so, for example, you could easily, have the mortgage payments too high, thinking that that's, a wise move because you've listened to someone else's podcast who has their value as wealth building at all costs. Well, perhaps that's not the case for the average listener, and perhaps that would be a disservice to their health, to their growth, to their family travel and experiences. We've recently had this conversation ourselves. We've got a rental property, as you and your audience would know. Interest rates aren't a pretty sight, and so we're having to certainly make decisions about family travel experiences. I'm getting a little bit itchy that I'd love to do another course this year. And so, looking at where does wealth sit and wealth building and financial freedom sit in our personal value hierarchies, mine and my fiance's, because otherwise the pain we're enduring perhaps is ultimately a disservice to our fulfillment and our values, because we're taking actions, but to your point, it's not quite squared up with the hierarchy if we really look at it in detail and against what's most important to us.
That's awesome. Okay. So let's say that's important, right? Hierarchy, values, super important. Let's say that we've identified that things need to be changed there in terms of that hierarchy, or maybe we don't even know what our values yet are, but we do know that our behavior is not necessarily functional in some areas. How do we change our behavior?
Got it. As it relates to changing the values, again, the first thing is self-awareness, absolutely clear on the values, again, the priorities, understanding the order. The second thing there would be if we perceive that, perhaps in this example, we're somewhat on track with our values, but we don't have that real congruency or the behavior patterns that really back it up to the degree that we'd like. Again, it's going to be connecting the dots on how what we perceive would be wise, how it benefits our values. Okay, so connecting those dots there. Again, a common one is health and fitness. It's a social idealism in many cases that we should have 6-pack abs and we should be going to the gym and these sort of things here. Having someone else's expectation put onto us is going to do nothing for you and your values hierarchy. It's going to be understanding. In this case, I was thinking about the other day. If you look at the wealthiest investors in the world, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're not young spring chickens, right? So you could say that one link could be prioritizing your health, just as an example, means that you're going to live longer and have more years to accumulate wealth. So just an example there again of how you can change the behaviors, create further buy-in of being clear on the goal that you'd love to achieve, making sure it's your goal and not a social idealism from others, and then connecting that to your values hierarchy. The last thing that I'll just cover, which we've talked about, is again this idea of self-sabotage, limiting beliefs, that sort of thing. And we've covered it today from the sense of understanding that self-sabotage is very often a conflicting agenda. In fact, I would say that it is a conflicting agenda. Now, the question is it a slight deviation from your values, as in, you're conscious of prioritizing value number 1, but you're acting on value number 3, which isn't the end of the world. It's actually a small tweak to make, becoming conscious of it and recalibrating some things there, and or readjusting your expectations for yourself and valuing yourself for who you are, as I said with those other client examples I'd given about the wine and cheese. But the other thing that I would really suggest clients reflect on, Darcy, and I mean this is a huge topic, and again the bulk of the work I do with clients, so obviously we can't go into all the nuances with it today, but it's going to be along the lines of what I suggested earlier, of understanding that we're all influenced by these past experiences that we've had. Trauma is a very obvious one, and people tend to be very self-aware of its very sort of PC now awareness to that. But the part that I would add to it perhaps is, rather than just being conscious of, I've gone through this in my upbringing or childhood, this was hard, I've been through this event, it was traumatic, actually identifying and taking the time to consider how your beliefs or behavior patterns perhaps have been born from these traumatic or painful events. Because again, we're talking about, many people say they would love to achieve in the area of finance, or they say they'd love to start a business. But then when it comes to it, they have a fear of rejection, or they have a fear of failure, or they have a belief they're not smart enough. So we're not born with these beliefs, believe it or not. Some people will just say, my dad was like this, I'm like this. I've never brought that. Understanding that the past truly informs the present, right? We've spoke about how the voids and the things that we perceive as missing in the former episode really dictate, Darcy, what's most important to us, and truly what's authentic and inspiring to us, meaningful, which is really the place we want to be acting from. But I think also trying to bring the unconscious conscious of how the past pain that we have perceived, how that is influencing what we do or don't do. Because again, if we can bring that conscious, look, I don't think it would be a realistic expectation to say that bringing it conscious is going to resolve everything for your audience, but it is absolutely profound that if we can start to become aware of how our past pain points, negative experiences that we've associated in our subconscious, how they can justify certain actions we take or don't take via these survival mechanisms I've spoken about. If we can bring that into our consciousness, Darcy, and we can see that playing out in our life, we become free to choose a different direction that's more in line with our values.
I hear it. Yeah, no, that's good. There's so much in this, but that's the good thing about podcasts, right? People can just play it again, and I would encourage people to do so. I want to just pivot quickly from the inside world to the outside world, right? So we've talked a lot about wealth begins in the mind before it begins in the wallet, right? So before you actually see on the outside, it has to happen first on the inside. And so let's now maybe talk about the opposite of that, like engineering your outside world so that there can be an internal change. And before we hit record, we were talking about a shared experience that you and I both gone through, or you're currently going through, where you're contemplating a move to a bigger office premises and how that can kind of indirectly create growth. And so like there's a book, and I can't remember the name of it, by James Clear. I can't remember, but it's all about that. Thank you. Atomic Habits. Yeah, just doing really simple things around you to create the structures and systems in place rather than rely on the internal motivations can sometimes be a really cool hack. So you could just share maybe an example around how you're kind of making that work to create change
great one. So I believe, Darcy, what we were speaking about earlier is, I think I sort of was just speaking to you about your show and your new setup, which I love. And I was just saying, actually, coincidentally, I've just hired an office next door to, whilst I'm in no rush, but, work on getting towards producing more content or a show myself in the future. And I think I sort of just made a joke that in one regard, you could say I'm not quite ready to do the show, but it was a great opportunity in terms of the lease. It's literally, 5 meters to the, behind me to go into the new space. And so, I mean, as it relates to perhaps a takeaway from that for the audience, it's going to be looking at how you can structure your environment in a way to support your values. And, whether that's your office space, the people, your relationships, your partner. I believe I said in the former episode that it would be a fantasy or an unrealistic expectation to expect others to have the same values as you. I mean, that's the definition of projection, right? Just because this is important to me, you should do it. And that's going to be futile. I mean, that's like you walking down the street and giving someone a financial plan where they haven't asked for it and they don't have their own intrinsic why, or me trying to create change in one of my siblings where they haven't asked or they don't have that real reason to do it, right? And believe me, I've tried, maybe you have as well. So, looking at our environment, I believe, whether it's our office, whether it's our partner, our friends who we associate with, and actually, again, being objective with that in terms of is the environment actually supportive of our values? That said, we don't want to live in fantasy land that it's only positive thinking and it's only going to support our values. If we go back to the idea of, pain, pleasure, the values actually transcends both of that to where we can endure both sides of things, the pain and the pleasure in the pursuit of what's meaningful. But it is wise, of course, to look at, our routines, our structure, our environment. Many people would like to get ahead and achieve, but let's say they've got almost legacy relationships of people they've always known, or cousins that they just expect that they should hang out with. And I'm not per se saying cut these people off, but perhaps looking at our environment, how we spend our time, the people, and actually, is this congruent and supportive of our values and of our vision?
Makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people who smoke would often say they would probably be more likely to smoke when they drink, when they go to a pub, or
yes,
when they go and visit the in-laws or something like that, right?
Yes.
So sometimes it's like changing your environment, changing your habit. Other times you're dealing with something that you don't want to change because it's probably in that value hierarchy. Like maybe it's a relationship and maybe it's a commitment to your husband or wife that you made and you want to take it seriously. Therefore, that sometimes they trigger you or it's damaging or create something in you which leads to bad outcomes in your life. But again, it goes back to that value hierarchy. So as we finish up, how important are relationships in this whole wealth building journey from a psychological perspective? And when those relationships aren't quite functioning super well,
yeah,
what is the best way to at least start the process of, I guess, fixing that problem? Like might not be able to fix the relationship, but you might be able to fix the effects potentially on specifically your pursuits around wealth, right?
Yeah, look, 100%. So, again, the environment, relationships, absolutely crucial. And again, it's not going to be realistic to have the same values hierarchy or expect them to have the same, but for them to be brought into a shared vision is how I would explain that to my clients. Okay, so perhaps let's say, for example, well, not example, I've mentioned to you earlier that wealth building is important to me because I would love to work with clients overseas. Let's say there's a, touch wood, maybe I get invited to some, great podcast overseas. I would love to be able to go and do that and share what's important to me, even if perhaps it wasn't the wisest financial idea to get on a flight just for the show, but maybe that's important to me and part of my mission. And so I have my own reason behind the wealth building in that example. My fiance may have a completely different reason. For her, it might be, giving our children the opportunities that she never had, void value, just to go back to that. Or it could be, that she's seen people that she cares about, get cancer or have health challenges. And if she or in our family had wealth, then we can support those relationships. So it's, again, I know I've said it earlier, but to really add some nuance to it, it's not wise to expect them to have the same values, but to have meaningful conversations about what's important to you, what's important to them, and how there can be a synergistic long-term vision that supports the expression of both people's values. Again, it's not going to be the same, but looking for opportunities to actually find purpose between both of those individual missions. So we have got it's like in relationships, right? It's healthy to have your own identity, your own self-worth, not to get that all from your partner, but have your own, healthy sense of self, but equally to have a combined vision and actually a shared direction. And clearly that's most important with your intimate relationships and wife, husband, etc. But again, even other relationships, I think is important because, we've all heard the quote, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And so engineering that environment, having those meaningful conversations with our other half, and, perhaps if, I think if you ask the average partner if you want to be wealthy, I can't imagine them saying no. But again, perhaps they have a different reason for that. My wife likes nice handbags. Now, I don't quite get that. But, if that is a link for her to where she would love to be able to buy a nice handbag one day and not have to overthink it. As much as I don't get that personally, that creates a buy-in for both of us in our own way for that shared vision, which is obviously going to result in not only relational fulfillment, but fulfillment of each of our own values as well.
There's another episode right there, Hayden. I think we've got another hour to give just around the different financial personalities and how you can optimize that, right? All right, we'll put that one into the future, though, in terms of an idea. Man, we've covered a lot of ground, again, in today's episode, so I wanted to thank you very much for your time today. I know you've got a busy day. Thanks for tuning in to the Everyday Investor Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard and you want more, check out the Everyday Investor with Darcy Ungaro on YouTube. Follow me on all the socials and check out some of the online courses, sign up to the free fortnightly newsletter, and more. All the links are right there in the show notes. As I leave you, remember, some investments or strategies discussed here may result in financial loss. Always do your own research and seek qualified advice if you can before making any investment decisions. See you next week.